Welcome back to the Corner of Story and Game, a podcast that explores the intersection of storycraft and game design. I'm your host, Gerald Ford, and today we're going to dive back into the lenses from the Art of Game Design by Jesse Schell. Joining me is Lauren Bond, a senior narrative game designer at Wizards of the Coast. Lauren is involved in the incredible world-building activities on Magic the Gathering. And before this role, she worked in streaming coordination at Gen Con, programming and production at Geek Space TV, and even as a special education teacher in Seattle. Lauren brings a wealth of knowledge not just in design, but in education, psychology, and performance. The lenses we're going to explore this time are the lens of expected value and the lens of chance. Specifically, we're going to talk about how these two lenses impact our considerations in a game's design. So, let's get into it. Lauren, thank you for joining me.
I'm very excited to be here. I like talking about the games. I say it like this more. Give me more. Yes.
Well, I am thrilled that you are here to talk with me about the games.
The games. The games.
So we're gonna chat today about two of the lenses because I've been doing this ongoing, sporadic now series about the lenses from Jesse Schell's The Art of Game Design. But before we dive into those, I like to set the stage with your origin story. How did you fall in love with gaming, writing, worlds, storycraft, all of it, and the path to today?
Yeah. So meandering is probably the short answer, but I didn't grow up with like a lot of access to games or gaming systems. We had Macs, and there were only so many games that they made for Macs. But when I got into college and I started playing more games, I was like, dang, you can tell stories, but also players can make choices in them. And I was like, Mass Effect 1 was the one that I played, and I went, oh my God, like, school. And then that sort of, also inevitably led into RPGs. I played a lot of D&D at 4th edition. That's personal. Have a soft spot for that one. And, met other friends kind of in the gaming field. I've been an improviser for a long time, so that was a very natural progression. But I actually started in games in the production side. I did a lot of live streaming production for a while, which was also a thing I sort of meandered my way into because I ended up on a live streaming show, and then that led to a bunch of other opportunities and working with Gen Con and running a small studio with one of my friends for a little while, or I guess I should say helping her run the small studio. It was not my studio. I just put schedules together. And then that eventually led to being a producer at Wizards, and then that led to being a narrative designer at Wizards, because during a lot of my RPG sort of background and kind of streaming my era of streaming, I was also designing a lot of RPGs and doing some freelance work on the side as well. So that is the very meandering tale of how did I end up here. I don't have a good career path example that I can offer to anyone. I was a teacher for a little while too. I did clinical research at a hospital for a couple of years.
That's a journey. That is a journey right
there.
This
is what happens when you get a degree in psychology and one in theater. And your parents ask you, what are you going to do with it? Give them a big shrug.
Figure it out as you go.
Yep.
That's cool. So do you still stream? Before we move on to everything else, let's talk about that.
I do. And I know that I've been streaming for about 8 years at this point because I get the resub notifications, and the number of months just keeps getting longer and longer. And I'm like, I love that there are still people that have literally seen me from the first show that I did, and they're still here now. It's kind of this little journey that we've all been on together. Most of what I stream now is cosplay content because I spend a lot of my workday doing narrative design and game work. And so then I like having something really crafty and physical to do with my hands. And it's a nice break from the very big brain thinks to a very different kind of big brain thinks.
Very cool. So at Wizards of the Coast, kind of give me a Cole's Notes version of your job description. What is it you do as a narrative designer there?
Yeah, so my team is primarily responsible for what we refer to as world building, as opposed to the story team. There's a couple of other folks who they run our web fiction and kind of our overarching storylines. We interface with them really closely, but that's not my primary responsibility. So what we sort of operate as on the narrative design team is making all the backstory and the lore. Who are the people, the factions, the creatures, the sort of meat of our individual settings, and then interfacing between game design and our art directors to sort of make all of that into a cohesive whole that matches with the mechanics, but also has a sort of visual through line and alignment. So we also do a lot of cross communication work
Very cool. Okay, we're gonna move on, and I don't want to nerd out about the magic world, but I am curious.
You can touch on it. It's all good.
I am curious, seeing as the background and the lore is your thing. Do you have a favorite piece of lore? Like,
Oh, that's a tough one. I honestly can't talk about a lot of my favorite things because it's in the set that I led that's coming out shortly.
previously released stuff. What's your
But
favorite from pre-published stuff?
personally, one of my favorite characters, and this is that piece of game design, I love Teysa Karlov, because she is the most Orzhov of Orzavi. She like runs basically like a debt collector law organization. Like they are, but it's also one of my favorite play styles. And that to me is the sort of beautiful integration of like narrative and gameplay, where it's like, yes, of course, she is perfectly representative of the gameplay mechanics that I like to play. And so then I also like her as a character because, you know, she's very cutthroat, but she wears a cool pantsuit while she's doing it. So I personally really like that. To me is something that I always enjoy, is I'm like, I am attached to this character because they represent something that I enjoy doing in the game.
Very cool. All right. I won't go on about my buddy Dak and Blackblade and how much I loved him as an OG player. Yeah.
A little bit.
Thanks. Just twist.
Just I love Blade. Yeah. Okay.
All right. One thing I do before we move on, creative types like us, we do like to have our fingers into different things. I'm just curious, are there other areas that you also have thought about or played with, or like, have you ever tried digital game design or board game? Like, I'm just curious.
Yeah. Most of my background, I'd say, is in physical games. I did most of my work in RPGs. And writing both narrative for RPG systems. I did a playset for a game called Weave, and then I also made my own RPG, a Powered by the Apocalypse system, and it did a lot of like hacks and running games. So that's really, and a lot of that honestly is just more the accessibility. It's a lot easier for me to pick up a set of dice and kind of come up with some mechanics focused around something that I have physical access to. And I also love the challenge of learning new skills. So like over time, been kind of picking up little bits of twine and like staring over at Unity being like, yeah, you're probably a thing I want to touch at some point. And yeah, inevitably cosplay also leads me into like learning a whole bunch of new programs. So I was like, maybe I'll pick up Blender, I guess. So the audacity of a cosplayer, which looks at a thing and being like, I could make that. I've never made anything like that ever before. And I've definitely done that with like video games. I'm like, I can make that. Like you've never made that before. I'm like, yeah, but I'd learn. So yeah, mostly I've worked in physical games, but someday I would love to kind of get my hands on more, maybe not even necessarily more linear, but just like a different format, because that's part of the puzzle of figuring it out.
Very cool. What about LARPs, seeing as you're a cosplayer?
I haven't really done LARPs. I've done a couple. I love that, and which is funny because like I'm a cosplayer and I'm an improviser, but there's something very stressful about LARPs, or like the idea of them. I have done like interactive events, like improv shows and things like that, where they're sort of like sitting in the space between like escape room and LARP and like improv show, and this kind of very interesting sort of intersection. So I also, yeah, like big fan of trying weird stuff and being like, let's do a different thing. But I've done like 2 LARPs in my life. And they're very like small group things. I do remember there's a convention called Big Bad Con that they host a lot of LARPs. It's a tabletop focused convention. And there was one that I like lament a little bit that I didn't join, which was everyone plays as a different Nick Cage character, putting together a movie directed by Nick Cage.
Wow.
It's like that. Again, I have a soft spot for the weird things.
That's amazing.
Yeah. I don't know if that exists in a formal rules document anywhere, but that's a thing that someone did once, and I love it.
That's so cool. All right. Let's dig into these lenses. So we're going to talk about 2 lenses today. We're going to talk about the lens. Hang on, let me check my notes. The lens of the lens of expected value and the lens of chance. So and how these two kind of play off each other and contradict each other and back each other up, and it's all crazy. So let's dig into it. How do you define the 2 lenses? I guess we can all look it up in the book, but how do you define them?
I think what was interesting to me is like looking at them and being like, that's fascinating that they're defined separately, because they for me feel so like inherently interrelated, because like the expected value is really all about like the probability of something happening within your game. And then chance is, does a thing have a probability of happening or not happening, right? And so what is really quantifying the other? And I think when it comes to game design, we sometimes you can talk about randomization is a huge equalizer in games. So like if you play shoots and ladders, you don't know who's going to win. I realize I used the British word for that game. I'm pretty sure. I think it's snakes and ladders here, isn't it? Yeah, shoots and ladders is what it is in England. Okay. Occasionally things like that, my childhood creep into my adulthood. But like it's entirely random, right? You know, an adult can play with a 2-year-old and they have an equal chance of winning because there's counting involved, but otherwise it's just dice rolling. But at the same time, that sort of equalizing can be very frustrating for players because there's no sort of sense of skill, or they don't feel like their skills are being rewarded, or they don't have a sense of progression. And I think that's a really important one. And so both of them have a really strong, or I'd say like chance has a really strong place within your game, but you need to quantify and understand what its role in your game is. And that's where the expected value comes in.
That makes sense. But in a game like Magic, where, again, I'll use Magic because it's an easy touch point.
It's all good. It's cards. It does have that feeling to it.
There you go. I should have probably had one of my decks in my hands, but there's expectations that are developed, not just from the mechanics and the art and the lore and the words, but also the packaging and the way that packs are randomized, like you're talking about. What are the considerations taken in to applying that lens to something like Magic?
Yeah. So from my end, and this comes honestly throughout our entire process, like we have a thing we talk about in Magic called ASFAN, which it's not an acronym. It literally just stands for as you fan out the card. So it's this like idea that what do you see when you open up a booster pack and you fan out the cards, and what cards are in your hands when you're doing that. And there's actually a bunch of math involved. There's spreadsheets that allow us to kind of calculate what's the chance of them encountering a given thing within the set, which obviously from a gameplay perspective, very important for like how they want to structure the set. What's the chance you're going to get a removal spell, a draw spell, a particular draft strategy? But from a narrative perspective, it is also in how likely is it that a player is going to interact with that part of the setting? And how do I put different parts of my setting in different places? And it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, because you sort of immediately you think, well, I should put on commons and uncommons the things you're going to see the most frequently, like the stuff I want you to see the most. But at the same time, like those cards tend to only be used in like the limited environment. And so you're going to see them when they're playing a draft, but they're not necessarily going to make it into someone's commander deck or into their modern deck or even into like a standard constructed deck. They're also probably not what marketing's going to lead with, or the characters that packaging wants to put, because, you know, they're cool, but they're like your background NPC. They're the people who might have a line of dialogue, but like probably don't. So then I also want to think about like what are like the heavy hitters of my setting? Who are the characters that are really important, that are going to become kind of touch points that stay with the game for a lot longer, or stay in the sort of zeitgeist of the game for a lot longer? So from a narrative perspective, it is a tool. That chance of a player opening an individual card is one, I think, that I can manipulate, in the sense, not that I'm manipulating whether or not they open that card, but whether or not that's a card marketing is going to show off or people are going to talk about more. But I can also utilize a card's individual frequency to sort of target what I want to showcase about a world or a setting. I like to think of it as making the things that are common in the world feel common in the pack.
That makes sense. So you come to expect a certain type of value based on the lore around a character or around a creature.
Yeah, and that they reinforce each other then. So, right, if you're going to open your packs and you see a ton of soldiers, right, for whatever reason, you're going to assume that probably means there's a bunch of soldiers in that world, because you've got like 10 of them in your, you know, in your deck or in your draft pool. And so I don't want to be like lying to the players to be like, no, there's like 3 of them in the whole world, but you opened a ton of them in your pack. So then becomes that alignment between what's common in the world and where am I putting that things on cards. If it's a low magic setting, I'm not necessarily going to put a bunch of spell effects on my common cards. If it's a high magic setting, I absolutely would. I want everything to be big and splashy and magical to sort of reinforce that aspect of the world. And so then the gameplay kind of tells the player what type of setting, what type of world it is. Is it gritty? Is it grim? Is it uplifting? Is it magical? Are dragons a frequent thing, or is it angels in this particular setting?
Right. And do you come to expect not just the thematics and the flares? Like, let's take the brothers, the Urs, but you also come to expect a type of mechanic, I suppose, as well, based on...
Yeah, so it becomes that kind of interplay between all of those things. So if I know, like, if in a faction set, or like, so Brothers War, for example, artifacts everywhere. We knew there's going to be a ton of artifacts. That's an important part of the setting because it makes sense for both of those players. So we're going to kind of see them across all cards. For that, we would even say something like, you want the Asfan to be like 1 or 2. Like every pack, you're going to be opening 1 or 2 artifact cards. And so then we kind of can get a particular card type in really frequently. But then we also have things like, ooh, this faction has a particular mechanic we associate with them. So let's make sure we sort of see it at that spread. And that aligns to gameplay. But it also means I need to make sure that like that mechanic that game design has decided is going to show across all these rarities, like has a cohesive theming to it, so that you can say like, oh, if I expect to get 10 of these cards in my draft, I keep using that number, but sure, whatever. 4 of these in my draft pack, then it makes sense. Like that is a thing that has a significant presence in the setting that I'm going to design to. So a lot of it for me is taking the expected values and working backwards, saying what are my expected values of how the set's going to look when someone's opening it, and then how the sort of meta of interaction is going to look, and then how do I design my narrative to make all of those things make sense.
Beautiful. Does it even extend the colors? Like we have an expected value from blue versus the white versus black.
So game design has a pretty solid structure for the most part. And like with color identity is one of those things, like it's going to be basically even. It does look different based on particular card types or spell effects, just because of how the mechanics work out. So the perk for that is that I know that that's going to be the case. There will always be the 5 colors. No, there will not be 4 in a given set because people would not enjoy that. That would not be fun. So I can start from that point and say, okay, how am I spreading? I know that this is equal. How am I spreading that across all of my colors or across all of a set? So it's, in some cases, that's like the expected value of that is very low randomization. Like I expect that to be very consistent across most draft experiences. So it becomes, in that instance, a little bit less of something that I have to like really design to, because it's just so fundamental to the gameplay and to like the structure of my game. It's sort of like if I were to think of a first person shooter or something, like it's like, yeah, they're going to have guns, right? Like that is just like sort of a core aspect to it that is part of the game. And so I can make that assumption early on. And I can assume that every time someone plays, they're going to interact with someone with a weapon.
Smart. All right. We're going to get off magic for a while here.
All good.
I can't say forever, but for a while. Yeah, right. So, I'm taking...
In response.
We could dive into the difference between drafting and deck construction and how that impacts the randomization. But no, we're not gonna. We're gonna go back to narrative because I want to talk narrative and role-playing games. So taking that consideration of this lens, let's apply it to the world of designing role-playing games, running role-playing games even. I guess, what would be your key takeaways from what you've learned that you can apply in different mediums like RPGs?
Yeah, so I did I got very into RPG design for a while, had a lot of fun with that, and also ran so many hours of streaming RPGs. I have not done the math, but it's a lot. And so the breadth of kind of different systems that I played with was very interesting. And I've played in a lot of different styles of table too. I did a D&D game that was very like, we're playing rules as written. I did a Shadowrun game where we tried our best to play rules as written. I don't know how familiar are with them, but they are complicated. So we did our best. And then, I played Powered by the Apocalypse games, which are just like very narrative, very loosey-goosey. Like the rules are written and it's actually kind of hard to break them because a lot of them are very flexible. So, and this is a little bit of the tension. And I think you mentioned this earlier, that there can be a tension between sort of expected value and chance, right? This idea that there is randomness inherent in a system, but expected value is like players want an amount of predictability, an amount of being able to say, I know if I can succeed or fail, or I understand the likelihood of succeeding or failing. And that chance, while it can be a great equalizer and it can also be very inspiring, can be disappointing, kind of that flip side. And, we see it in Magic too, just before that, like the joy of drawing the card that you need right at the perfect moment can be really fun, but that's not how you want to build your decks, right? You want to build them for a sense of consistency. And I think that is, when it comes to designing an RPG system, it's back to that initial statement of like, what is the purpose of chance in your game? And it can serve multiple purposes in your game, but sort of understanding what it is. So if you're a D20 system, you have it. Sometimes we can talk about it as like very swingy, right? The odds of rolling a 1 or rolling a 20 are identical, which means you have a really big range of what you can roll versus a Powered by the Apocalypse 2d6. So you have a bell curve. So the odds of you have in one instance a lot more predictability of like the most common outcome. And the flip side of that, though, is that in D&D, for example, you can build a character to a point that they can guarantee success, right? Like you can have enough modifiers to a skill that you can know with certainty that you will succeed, and unless you're playing with like auto fail rules or anything like that. Whereas, and that is inherent to the system as a way to express player skill, or not player skill, character skill. Like your character has gotten better because it went from being a thing, then maybe they have a chance of succeeding if you roll high enough, to being like, I have a plus 20 modifier. Like, unless I'm talking to the king, like we're probably going to win. I am the most charismatic bard that has ever barded. And on the flip side, in a system like Powered by the Apocalypse, where you're rolling 2d6, you have a much flatter curve. So you kind of know as a GM or even as a player that you're probably going to be okay. Like, but you have a much lower chance of it going horribly wrong or going super well. And that system also has a much smaller range for players to skill up. So you almost never get to a point where you can like guarantee a particular outcome. You're generally like, the best you sort of get is being like, I can probably ensure I'll never completely fail. And that is because the dice system, or that is like your character's skill improvement, is less of an important aspect to that game. Like you're not trying to like progress to being a demigod and super powerful, but that is sort of the fantasy of like the D&D RPG adventure group of becoming like powerful and strong and skilled, and like you start from the sort of beginnings and you work your way up to this sort of advanced state. Granted, that is not how everyone plays. I'm just sort of they're RPGs. You play them however you want. So sort of just discussing like this idea of, in one instance, chance is there to give you this feeling like over time you can beat chance, you can guarantee success. Whereas I would say in Powered by the Apocalypse, it's really more there as like an inspiration tool, where it's like, okay, this didn't go exactly how you wanted, so now we all get to think about why that happened, as opposed to it's a representation of like your character's skill improving over time. So yeah, from that mechanics perspective, it's really saying, what's the purpose of chance in your game? And I rambled a little bit to get to expected value, and where that comes in is, in both instances, it's really about how you want to control chance by defining the probabilities. And chances inherently has probabilities. Like that's the whole point, is it's not guaranteed in one direction or another, but you as the designer can shape around the chance of something happening and shape your system to make use of how frequent or infrequent something is, and that then feeds into what's the purpose of chance that's in your game. So in Magic, we build that into the way that a set is constructed to give players opportunities to manipulate chance where they want to, from like having additional cards that they can draw to, scry effects, to anything you kind of lets them like sort through their library, or fetching up lands in, systems like D&D, it's about sort of outskilling difficulty challenges. And in others, it can be about like, do you have bonuses that you can spend to sort of manipulate, the results of a particular outcome? And that can represent a lot of different things in your world as a designer. It was very rambly, but I hope that made some sense.
No, it made perfect sense. It's not nearly as rambly as it probably sounded in your head.
Try. Get the coherent thought out.
It sounds like expected value almost starts in RPGs when at system selection, like when a player's picking what game you're going to pick. But here's the thing. People like us who love the math and love getting under the hood, we understand, okay, if I'm going to play Daggerheart with a 2d12 system versus if I'm going to play old school Wraith with a bazillion d10s, I understand the swings and I understand what's going to happen with the math there. But how do you, as a designer, how do you sell, market, promote, push out your system and explain the expected value in a way that makes sense to a player?
For sure. I think there's a lot of different routes. I think there is a lot of different routes that you could take to how this process works. One of the things when I was like playing a lot of different RPGs that I was sort of very passionate about is saying like, hey, you should pick the system based on the experience that you as a player want. Because also in talking about variables and chance, the largest variable in any game is the players. Like inherently, because they're making all the choices. They're like the dice aren't telling you what to do. They're sort of defining the consequences. So like the player, the GM, like they are the ones that are the largest factor that is hard to control for. And so I think when you're creating your game, knowing what type of experience you want your players to have and being very clear about that. Like this is, and I even use that to the extent of like when I'm like convincing people of what type of RPG they want to play. And I will ask questions about like, how much role play do you want? How much decision making do you want to have as a player? How much do you want to min-max something? And I often would think about it in terms of being like, okay, I know they like this type of video game. So here's like a good in route because this will feel very familiar to them. And then that might open them up to something else that they're interested in. But if you're not clear yourself as a designer, like what type of experience you want your players to have, and therefore how you're going to describe the feeling of playing your game, you're probably going to struggle to get people to like know that they want to play it. And it's like, I had a friend who wrote a game called Thirsty Sword Lesbians. And like, that is just the best marketing hook. Like she knew exactly what she was doing when she wrote that game. Like it is in the title. It does what it says on the tin. And then it also reinforces that because it's a powered by the apocalypse system. It's very simple. It's light in terms of mechanics. It's really focused about like you build your character, you interact with each other. And the mechanics themselves reinforce all of the conflicts. You can be thirsty and you can be a lesbian and you can fight with a sword. Right, like it's got all of those things. I remember when she told us about it, she's like, I think I might need to change the name. And we were like, me and my wife were like, no, I don't think you do. And she did not. So like I think it's when you're creating something, you really want to create that whole package. Even on I'm gonna bring it back to Magic for a second too. Even on like the singular scale of like an individual card, part of our job is taking the mechanics that are on there and then converting that into something to ask an artist to draw, which is a thrilling experience because I can be like, please draw a tiny raccoon with a hat. And they will be like, I drew a tiny raccoon with a hat. And I'm like, you did, didn't you? But I need to decide that like that card makes sense to be a tiny raccoon with a hat. So I don't want that card to ever lie to someone. Like I want the whole package together to make sense to you as a player. And so it's the same way of like how you describe your game and the mechanics that you've chosen to put in your game. If you're making Shadowrun and you're asking players to roll 42 d6s, like don't describe your game as like happy, being like you're gonna do a ton of like RP. You might do a ton of RP, but like they're also gonna do a bunch of math. And like you want to be very open about that kind of experience that you're asking people to come to when you're playing your game.
There is something dramatic, though, about picking up 2 fistfuls of dice, throwing them on the table, and then having to stop action and count. Like there's suspense. There's something cinematic about that moment. But
Oh, there absolutely is, but it's a very particular kind of experience. You're not as the player or the GM, like you're leaving certain things up to like the sort of external arbiter, which is a very different type of storytelling experience than being like, okay, you're going to tell me what you do, and then I'm going to like play off of that, and we're going to kind of yes and it. You can blend those things together, but just if you ever find yourself in the place where you're like fighting against what the mechanics are asking you to do, like you could play a different system. Sort of where I come to. I'm like, you could just do something different.
Or learn how to hack it.
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely how I got started. I played like a Stars Without Number, which is really fun in a lot of ways, but it was way more. I realized very early on, I was like, I cannot have player characters for an RPG show where we have like art of characters that have one hit point. They have one hit point. I don't want them all to die in the first episode. So I did like a heroic hack, which was basically like mostly massaging HP numbers to get to the point where I was like, we can use most of the rest of the mechanics in their entirety as long as you have more than one hit point.
That's cool. That kind of firmly leads us down the path of talking about chance a little bit more in the role-playing world. I'm curious, can you think of ways to use chance when it comes to narrative, like story beats in RPGs and like around the table? How does that impact the story being told and the character developments and that heavy narrative stuff we love so much?
Yeah, so in like let's separate these into two buckets, because if you have, I would say, like more of a video game style, right, where you actually have to code and write all of the outcomes, like it can't be fully open, you're gonna approach that a little bit differently than if you're playing an RPG at a table and you're the GM. And that sort of mindset, I think, is also important to split apart. I remember at one point I was doing the NaNoWriMo like many years ago, and I was like writing a scene with some characters. And I'd been doing so many RPG shows at this point that I like looked at the page and I was like, I wish they would just respond. Like, I was so used to working with like improvisers and people that would just like add to it that I was like, I have to write all the dialogue. What is this? That's so rude. So, having the right mindset as a designer when you're approaching it, solid place to start. I will say, when I have run RPGs, like I've also had the pleasure of running a lot for improvisers, and they take everything you say as a gift to destroy and to do something else with than you might have thought of in like the best possible way. And I think that is really, again, knowing your players is a big part of GMing, and how much sort of agency or control they want to have over the gameplay experience versus how much they kind of want to be like led through something and sort of not make a ton of decisions, and occasionally be able to cause trouble, but sort of like functionally like play through a story in a more interactive way. And I think those are both completely valid ways to play RPGs, and it's just important, you as a GM, to like know what group of players you're sitting down at the table with so that you plan appropriately, which is a lot to none. So the randomness piece, again, honestly, I've had more problems from player choices than I've ever had from like the dice deciding something, because a lot of it for me is that if I want a particular outcome, I just don't roll dice. Like you don't have to inject the randomness if you need a particular thing to happen because it makes sense, or it's going to be the most fun, or it's what everyone has agreed on. So in that instance, you really control the chance to just remove it and say, like, I have the agency to make that decision and I don't want this particular outcome. So then you can use it when it's like fun and exciting. And you're like, I am actually truly asking the universe to determine like whether or not this particular thing happens. And I have a cool idea to go in either direction and we'll make it work. I also sometimes, for smaller things, like I have a yes, no die. Sometimes players will be like, is this thing in the room? And I'll be like, I don't know, let's find out. And because it's fun either way, right? There's a problem to be solved if it's in the room. Normally it's my problem to be solved if it's in the room, and their problem to be solved if it's not. But sometimes, there's something in the middle. On the flip side, like when you're writing a video game and you have all of these outcomes, you're really already controlling for that chance, because there kind of is a limit to the number of the things that the player might do. And that allows you to to map a little bit more big picture, but also knowing that like you're not going to get that response back from the player. They're much more being led through. So you're going to kind of need to shape the next events to create that cohesive narrative, as opposed to the players potentially contributing to that when you're at a table.
What a dance. What a dance between these two lenses, these two concepts.
I was just, again, I'm still very stuck on the like, it's so weird that they're separate. The statistician in me being like, you can't have chance without a probability, and every probability has an expansion value. Like, what's the p-values here?
Wow, you really break it down.
I don't get that far most of the time, but I do get the pleasure of sitting in on like consumer insights testing every so often, and like my little psychology brain is like, yes, give me more. I want like qualitative data.
That's so cool.
So
cool.
Look, everyone has a little gremlin inside of themselves. So it's,
Oh, I'm just a bunch of gremlins wearing a hoodie.
Nice. Very nice.
All right. Well, let's bring the lens part of this conversation kind of to a head here, to an end. To bring it all together, I guess, like you're saying, the two seem like they're two sides of the same coin. Sometimes they're at odds. Sometimes they're working together. I guess to bring it home, how do you balance these? And then keeping that in mind, what advice would you have for young designers, narrative people based on this?
Yeah. For narrative specifically, I would say understand it and embrace it. So if your game, whatever system you're working in, understand whatever type of chance it has and sort of get familiar with those expected values. That was such a really like useful tool for me. I literally sat down with like the spreadsheet and calculated a bunch of ASPANs for like the first set that I worked on. Because I was like, okay, well, if I have this many of this card and this many, and if I put them in this slot versus here, and that just like bred in myself like so much familiarity with it that I could kind of get myself in the mindset of what it would be like once the player finally has this thing in their hands. And that also means you don't have to fight against it, or you're not like, oh my God, I can't believe no one ever saw this. It's like you put it in the rarest thing in the game or whatever that is. So really get to know what that is so that you can work alongside it rather than finding yourself fighting it as a narrative designer, and use that to create synergy with the structure of your world, your setting, who your characters are. Like, how often are people going to see them or interact with them? Maybe they'll never interact with them. Don't make that your favorite character. You'll just be sad. No one ever sees them. Right. Except that one person on Reddit. You and them, you'll be best buds forever. And from the flip side, as a game designer, when you're building a game with chance, like, decide why it's in your game. What purpose do you want it to serve? And I would say, to an extent, know that it's going to be in your game even if you don't want it. Like, because your players are playing the game. So very few things lack an amount of chance. The players will still do things you don't expect. So just kind of know it's there so that you can figure out how and when you want to control for it.
Nice. Do you watch TikToks at all? Have you seen
Occasionally.
Have you seen the guys who open cards on stream on TikToks?
No, I've mostly watched most of the MTG content I end up watching is YouTube. I put a lot of games on in the background. It is. I mean, I get one of the perks of the job is we do get packs of Magic at work. And so I do get to have that opening experience. And there is something like very cool about being like, oh, it's this character. Or, like, I can get that sense of like, oh, I saw like 3 of this dog. I love this dog, versus just like, oh, I really want to see this one character. And kind of that the joy in that experience. But yeah, it is important for me to occasionally open packs, not just because I want to. It's professionally opening packs.
Hey, so jealous. All right, well, I think that wraps up the talk about the lens. Is there anything you wanted to talk about on that topic before we move on?
No, I think with all the rambling, I covered all of the major points that I was inspired by.
One way or the other. Wonderful. All right, well, we're going to start heading towards the door, but I do have some questions I like to ask just to kind of get to know you a little bit better, and just because it's my show and I can do whatever the hell I want.
Heck yeah. You don't have to roll dice.
Nope. I just pick. But I might anyways. I have a philosophical question that I like to ask everybody who comes on the show, regardless of what you do and what industry you're from. So bear with me. The question is, in my opinion, there's a magical space at the intersection of obviously story and game, but narrative design, improv acting, screenplays, music, all these things where people can just get along. We just connect, and there's a shared language and a fellowship. If you agree with me, what is the magical thread that holds that space together?
I do agree. I do think that many of my favorite stories are told through interactivity and through games. And I think for me, empathy is not quite the right word, but it's in that space. When you are doing the thing, your experience of it is very different than when you are observing the thing, like reading a book or watching a movie. If you have to make the choices yourself, whatever those choices are, and every game has some form of choices because it involves an interaction, even if it's like, do I turn left or do I turn right in, my PvP match, that agency that you have changes the way in which you experience it and makes it a lot more personal. And then that can, on like a much higher level, like extend to learning and empathy and sort of experiencing things that you would never experience in your life through that lens of interactivity. But it can also be like, we have solved a problem together because I played this co-op game, or we are a team and we have defeated the other team together, and that sort of social element. But I think the doing of it is so intrinsic to the experience that it makes the story that much more real.
Fantastic. It's a good answer.
Here's my philosophical answer to your philosophical question.
Love it. Do a whole episode around that someday.
Nice.
Okay, quick fire round. Just a couple quick fire questions, get to know you a little bit better. What are you reading these days?
Right now, I'm between books, but I'm gonna probably be picking up Nona the Ninth, which is the third in the Locked Tomb series. I got through the first two, and dang were they a ride, and I'm not fully emotionally prepared for the third one, but I plan to start it soon. Probably my holiday read.
The second one, that series it was a thing. It was something.
It's very good. She is very good at changing point of view. That is like very slick.
Masterclass. Yeah. What are you playing these days?
So I had, when you sent over the questions, I had a very different answer. I was like, oh, I started Monument Valley 3. I play a lot of Final Fantasy. But like literally 2 days ago, I got re-obsessed with a game called Universal Paperclip, which is it's an idle game. You can play it in your browser, and you are an AI attempting to most efficiently create and sell paperclips. And I will leave it at that. And I will just say that it gets a little weird from there. But it's still all about paperclips.
It starts weird and gets weirder.
So you're just selling paper clips, just making them little clips.
Somebody's got to sell them.
Yeah, can recommend. It'll be like one day, and I may or may not have stayed up until like 4 a.m. because I was like, we're going. Oh God, this game took a turn. Yeah, so I knew Universal Paperclip. There you go.
Let me check it out. Thank you for that obsession. Okay. Here's the last one. Tough one. If your essence was perfectly distilled down, the essence of Lauren, and then injected into a game world, tabletop, role-playing, digital, whatever, A, what world would it be? And B, what would your stereotype, like your race, class, job, whatever, what would that be?
Yeah, I think I'm going to use magic because it's like sort of the easiest one. A Silver Quill student. They are the like language, but a little bit uptight nerds at the magic school, like our magic school and wizards, but I strongly identify with Silver Quill, which I don't know what else that says about me, but they're like a little bit theater kid, but also like very intense.
So cool.
Yeah, there you go. I'd be a human. I don't think I'm legendary. I think I'm just like a creature, like human wizard.
Not even a planeswalker.
No. Oh, absolutely not. Like I'm not I might be able to eke out being like an uncommon legend. That's about as good as I
That is, I love the game, but I've never dug really deep into the lore. Are there books that are just lore, collection of lore and world building? Like,
we've had some art books in the past, but actually most of it we release online alongside each set release. So there generally is an article that goes with each set's release that is the Planeswalker's Guide, and it kind of reviews the sort of lore of each setting. So you can check those out, and they're available. And then there is like extended fiction of comics and novels and things like that have come out as well.
I just want something big and hardbound on my shelf. That's all.
We could maybe someday print them all out. We used to make physical versions of our world guides, that they never went anywhere, but they were chunky. They're like 350-page documents.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, my friend, it's just time to head for the door. Before we go, I do like to open up a little space to signal boost. Is there something you're working on or have worked on you want to mention? Where can people find you online, your stream, all of that fun stuff?
Absolutely. You can find me basically everywhere online at Random Tuesday. I have essentially fully transitioned over to Blue Sky from Twitter, which I hadn't been on for like a year and a half anyway, or Instagram if you're interested in seeing cosplay things. And I stream on Twitch mostly on Sundays. And the main thing is my first main set magic that is releasing is coming out in spring of next year, and I am very nervous and very excited, so I hope you check it out. That's Tarkir Dragonstorm, and yeah, that's my next thing, so we'll see how it goes.
I have a binder and a whole bunch of sleeves just waiting, just right. Yeah, so I'm pumped. Okay, well, that's it. I'm going to push you out into the cold, but as you're heading out the door, I want to give you the final word. Do you have any parting words of wisdom?
Keep playing games. Please, I like working in games.
And that wraps up another episode of the Corner of Story and Game. Huge thanks to Lauren for sharing your insights on expected value, chance, and creating magic both on and off the table. If you've ever wondered how luck of the draw becomes a storytelling masterpiece, I hope this episode answered that, and maybe inspired your own design journey. Now, as much as I'd love to keep discussing the delicate dance between these two lenses, I've got to go open some booster packs. So, as always, thank you for taking your seat at the table. Until we meet again, keep creating, exploring, and sharing your stories and worlds. Stay safe, Wanderer. Your chair will be ready by the fire the next time you stop in at the Corner of Story and Game.